Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Crow, the original The Crow, because there's also plenty of other Crow things. There's, of course, The Crow Save Angels, which I've already reviewed. We also have Crow Salvation. We also have The Crow Wicked Prayer that ultimately has David Boreanaz and Tito Ortiz. So, going into this review, I definitely will not need any kind of notes of any kind because what had happened was I've tried to review this like a couple times, and every single time there's just kind of been some just kind of issue. Or ultimately, I did this review and then I must have accidentally deleted this review. I don't know how, I don't know why, but justifiably, the review is just absurdly gone. So I did all that work for nothing. But let's go into this review. So, in a very cryptic like sense, this movie really just spawned a lot of other things, even the Crow series. Mainly because I think there isn't enough information about this character in the very first series, but then also, or its very first attempt, I mean, because ultimately there's just not enough here on the drawing board, and I think it probably comes down to one, the death of the main actor who ends up playing Eric Draven, but it just kind of comes down to the fact that like there really doesn't feel like this movie has enough here. It kind of like goes through a couple of characters and then it's basically just done. And I'm like, wow, looking at this now, like seeing how like very skin and bones that it is to ultimately give you something interesting, but again, it doesn't quite all the way get there. And so you're just left with there being just a movie that honestly to me feels just unfinished. So going into this, have the we have the Crow very much feeling like a Joker-ish like character, much more so than I think maybe in some other iterations. But to me, like this character is basically the Joker with a healing factor. Because reasonably this character isn't dark and brooding. He's not like remembering his love that he had lost. Like there's no torture going on with this character. It's just okay, this character is pushed to finish some goal, and ultimately that is just it. We don't have enough to invest in the hero in this movie, which is kind of sad because everything is left to too much mystery. A lot of things, I guess, will ultimately force you to go into the comic books and maybe dip into that story a little bit more. I want to say that I want to have a lot of positives to say about this film just because of how it looks visually and reasonably a lot of attempts going on to this film to do something different. But yeah, also there are other The Crow films. So when looking at it, every single Crow film is basically a rebooted film, and maybe you might just like stuff better. Maybe you just might like uh, a much more thorough amount of people that The Crow has to kind of just run through in one film. So when looking at it, I wanna have a positive outlook about this film, but I just don't feel like there's enough there in the film. There's not enough meat on the bones, and so that's ultimately my biggest gripe is just that there isn't enough there. It also kind of focuses on a character that is a little girl called Sarah, And also, they kind of dip into Ernie Hudson's character a lot, which ultimately he's a beat cop that ultimately is looking into Eric Draven's case. And ultimately, I think like really you could rely on this movie being carried by those two people rather than the Crow himself. It just seems like the Crow is just a person that is just there to eventually kill someone, and it doesn't feel like the deaths that ultimately the Crow is doing isn't hard hitting enough. Like it just kind of feels like all the deaths are just kind of choreographed. To me, honestly, ultimately, I do not know if within this movie, like when looking at it, I'm not sure that every death has a crow symbol in it, but knowing full well that is always the way of which that it ends up going into. I don't know. It wasn't prominent enough to me to ultimately see any of the deaths have a crow sigil, but I could be wrong about that. Maybe there's something that I missed during those deaths. But anyways, going into this, we I think probably they have a really great concept here. Like they have a really great concept, and they have it to where it's a overall an interesting way to tell this story. I just think that there's something that got lost in translation to me, and ultimately maybe if I see this again later on, I will have a completely different opinion about it. But this is just what I have to say right now about the movie The Crow. So, let's go into spoiler variations about this movie. Let's kind of break it all down. Let's dust out that double five and otherwise go into spoilers about this movie. I apologize for anybody who is a fan of the Crow movie or any other Crow film, and I am just kind of just mentioning that like it wasn't enough for me. And ultimately knowing full well that the main character had literally died on screen, in some well, not an actual part of the movie, but like you know what I mean. Like he had died during filming. So yeah, like looking at it, it just like it's just heartbreaking to go into this film knowing full well that there could have been more of these. There could have been sequels. There could have been a series. There could have been any number of things that spurned from a Crow character that ultimately is very much like we had time to get into this. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this review. So I don't want to say that this is a bad movie. I just don't think there's enough there. So going into this, in spoiler terms, we have Eric Draven and Shelley who are seemingly signing petitions to try to get uh, to try to get people to like prevent this whole Devil's Night thing. I believe is the real true crux of this whole movie, because you have the main villain called Top Dollar that is mentioning how like, man, there used to be like some viciousness and some anarchy and destruction with Devil's Night. Now, like they're having greeting cards of this and in your local gas station or whatever for Devil's Night. Like whatever happened to all this? Like whatever happened to the destruction and this and that? I honestly think that Top Dollar is the best part of this entire film because he brings something vastly different to the table than any of the other villains. All the other villains are just kind of just there to die. but Top Dollar is a character that is the guy in the villain chair that ultimately is, or on the throne, and he very much is going through and giving us some interesting insight, talking about something that his father had said at some point, ultimately going into mentioning to us that uh, his bedroom business with him and two other women would leave a girl dead in his bed, and this and that, and Top Dollar, of course, being the main villain in this film. Like, it was very much interesting to me to see this character, but I just wish that there was like every single like lead up to that point, there would be villains that we could invest in their deaths, obviously. So going into this film, we have it to where in the very beginning of this, we have a bunch of thugs all crashing into Eric Draven and Shelley's apartment to go in and wreak havoc, go in and attack them, and then eventually go in to kill both of them. And we end up finding out via Ernie Hudson's description that Eric had been driven out of a window and swan dived onto the ground. So ultimately, we have it to where Eric is dead, and he had otherwise decided to come back from the grave, ultimately seeking vengeance on the people that had took his Shelley from him, and ultimately wanting to put this city right because it is falling apart. We don't have, in this iteration, we don't have this like drug ring that is going on. If anything, like, there's not much about that is kind of showcased in here. But you're just kind of led to believe that there is just all kinds of horrible things being bought and sold and this and that in this town. So we have it in this movie to where the very first enemy that the Crow is approaching is, of course, a character called Tintin. Ultimately, leading us to have it be easy for the Crow to find somebody, because ultimately the Crow is ultimately an actual bird-like crow that is flying around and eventually stumbles upon Tintin at first, but then eventually needs to find everyone else that is tied to this case. So ultimately we go first to Tintin, and Tintin is a blade thrower. Tintin is a kind of like a circus act to me, and I'm really enjoying the portion of which where Tintin is throwing blades and the crow is catching it, or ultimately he's getting stabbed by a blade or something like that, but it won't do anything. So ultimately the crow is begging him. It's like, try again, try harder, and really like getting to the point of like, dude, like everything that you're going to do is never going to be good enough. Because ultimately this guy is just boasting about he never misses and that he is just so good at his craft. Well, he has met his match tonight, and it ends up leading and bleeding Tintin into a gurney with a bunch of knives in his belly, which is showcased, which I thought was really weird. I'm like I get the visual, but overall, like, why would they have every single one of these blades still stuck in this person's body, leading him out to be hauled away? And plus, if this guy's already dead, wouldn't he be in some like body bag? But again, I guess that's just like, but hey, but the visual looks really cool, right? And then you're like, okay, sure, you're right. So the crow eventually bleeds into, I don't know why I'm saying bleed so much. Ultimately goes into finding a pawn shop character named Gideon. We find out that Gideon had sold a or had bought a ring off of Funboy, and Gideon notices that there is blood on the ring, and so ultimately Gideon decides to only, like, he knows that this ring is obviously stolen. So immediately he's basically like, dude, I'll just give you like $50. And Funboy is like, what? Like, dude, like this is like some high end like stuff. And he's like, dude, I know it's stolen. Like, this isn't like a charity case. Like, I knew you robbed this off of somebody. And so $50. So we have it to where the crow ends up appearing at Gideon's pawn shop. And here's a very interesting part. When you take the crow and he ends up quoting like Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven. This part is so fun. This part is quite easily the best part of this film, because you have the Raven being quoted to this person, but not only that, do you also have a shotgun full of wedding rings, which I thought was a very impactful, awesome like visual. So we have the crow ultimately going into Gideon's pawn shop and quoting the Raven Nevermore. And we end up having the crow mention to Gideon asking about a wedding ring, and being very detailed about the wedding ring, knowing full well that Gideon has it. So eventually, Crow scrambles through the pawn shop to try to find the right ring, and eventually he does. He ends up touching the wedding ring and ending up being reminded by the spirit of his wife, Shelley. And ultimately, it's really interesting to see like the crow having some visual representation of his wife, or ultimately getting some visual representation from the crow eventually, or from Ernie Hudson eventually. I mean, so there's a whole moment that I have to kind of get to into this film, because I'm very much leaving out the supporting characters. I'm pushing towards mostly getting through the villain characters, but there's a whole entire reason for that. So, because once we get to Funboy, then we'll get into the side characters. So we have Gideon, who eventually is trying very much viciously to tell this guy nothing, and basically tell him that he's like a freak or whatever. It's like, hey, like, he's trying to keep his business together and this and that. And so we end up having the crow eventually find his ring, and then after that he ends up not really wanting to kill Gideon, but having him being sent as a message to everyone else that he's going to go after, because ultimately he's asking to find where is Funboy and where is everyone else tied to this case. And eventually we figure out that the crow is going to get that information, but then after that he ends up basically 100% annihilating this pawn shop by there being a gas leak, and then shortly thereafter that shooting a shotgun full of wedding rings that ultimately explodes this pawn shop, leaving Gideon to scramble out of the pawn shop to lead him to going to Top Dollar to tell him everything that he knows about this crow character. So now let's get into the supporting characters. So we have Sarah, who is a girl from a broken home. She is the daughter of Darla, which I will get to her fairly shortly. in the very beginning of this, we have Sarah who is narrating to us about the world of which she lives in, and eventually Sarah ends up leaving into being otherwise tied to Ernie Hudson's character, which is a detective. I think his name is Al something. I'm assuming it's probably just Al. But anyways, like I think his title is like Sergeant Al something. But anyways, so I'm gonna just keep calling him Ernie Hudson. I think it's much easier to me, Ernie. So Ernie Hudson, yeah, he eventually buys a hot dog for Sarah, which is gonna kind of tell us that like Ernie's a nice guy, and ultimately he's justifiably going to be a cop that is going to help people throughout this movie. So we eventually have it to where the Crow is led to Fun Boy, and Fun Boy is, of course, seemingly with Sarah's mother, Darla, and so reasonably we end up having it to where we find out that Darla is kind of consistently subdued with morphine. Ultimately, when we have the Crow mixing up with Ernie Hudson the first time around, when ultimately he is talking to Ernie Hudson before all this kind of pops off and whatever, ultimately, like, it's funny that Ernie Hudson is scared of the Crow because ultimately this is a guy that's not living in fear against a police officer, and ultimately just kind of the Crow doesn't want to give the police officer any harm, but then again, like, he is like ultimately not going to cower in fear. And ultimately, funny enough, like, Ernie Hudson is trying to call this in to get backup because he's very scared of this character because he looks weird looking. And so basically, what ends up happening when Ernie Hudson makes his call in, Eric Draven completely vanishes to where ultimately driving Ernie Hudson to look into this case to know full well that he had spent some time with Eric Draven's wife, Shelley, which we'll get to that later. So, knowing full well that this guy has come back from the grave, and for Ernie Hudson, Eric Draven is like, why is he here? Like, if anything, is he like, how is he still alive? And that is probably what spooks him the most, seeing a ghost of a person that he knew. So, going into this, we now have Fun Boy. Fun Boy is at a bar with Darla, eventually leading to them going into the bedroom. We ultimately have the Crow otherwise surprise him and scare the crap out of him, Fun Boy, and ultimately leading to where Fun Boy in turn is just going to shell out bullets into the Crow, which of course does nothing. We ultimately have it to where in kind the Crow does the same exact thing, and funny enough, Fun Boy ultimately doesn't care about his own death. He ultimately is just mentioning how that the Crow had ruined his bed sheets because of all the blood that he has. Which I just thought was a bizarrish line. But in time, I was like, you know what? Like, that is really kind of, like, interesting that this character doesn't care at all. All that matters is that his sheets are dead, or his sheets are bloody. So, we have it to where eventually the Crow eventually goes to Darla and tries to rid her of all her morphine and ends up telling her that she needs to be a mother to her daughter Sarah. Because ultimately Sarah eventually does meet the Crow and ultimately has a otherwise tied to him via some way or another, I guess. More than likely, Shelley probably had maybe babysat for Sarah at some point. That doesn't really, the connection of that doesn't really seem to be cemented anywhere, but I guess that's what we're just supposed to convincingly think is going on. So because we ultimately have Sarah meeting the crow and ultimately throwing out there that it can't rain all the time. And so Sarah's like, oh my God, like I remember, I know that's you. Like I know that you would say that all the time. So we eventually have it to where the very next day Sarah is back home and Darla is actually trying to be a mother for once and ultimately trying to make eggs for her daughter. Ultimately, the daughter is at first like not convinced that her mother is back in town, let's just say. And so, anyways, the mother ends up just giving up right away and Sarah won't let her. It's like, oh no, like, yeah, like if you want to really be my mother, it's like, yeah, just eggs over easy and just good enough for me. So that's like a really sweet and nice moment and I really enjoy it. So we go into we go into now having the ultimate review of this thing going on forward. And so the crow ends up going into meeting Ernie Hudson, and basically it seems like they're really having a candid conversation where Ernie Hudson is assuming that the crow is just going to end up like vanishing at some point, and the crow is like, well, how about I just use your front door? Like, how about I just like I'm not a ghost all the time? And so reasonably Eric is trying to fish for more information, trying to fish for who ultimately could be very much more tied to this case, and why is it that nobody did anything about his case? Why isn't there anybody arrested? And so reasonably Ernie Hudson basically said it's like, well, hey, sorry, but you guys were nobodies. Like reasonably you guys just end up dying the way you did and nobody really cared, sadly enough. So recently it pushed no one to get to this case. Nobody was hard pressed to go into looking into this case because ultimately there are some very high end individuals tied to this, aka top dollar probably. So we have it to where we find out that Eric had through Ernie Hudson's eyes realized that Ernie Hudson had really cared about this case. And so ultimately we find out that Ernie Hudson's character had spent numerous hours with Shelley at the doctor's trying to see ultimately if she would make it out of all this, and to where Ernie Hudson mentions that he's like, well, yeah, I would have hoped that she would have made it out. I was really hoping for it because I was hoping to make a case out of this finally. I was hoping to like come after these people that I know full well were doing all this. We're doing all this Devil Knight stuff and all of this garbage. So we have it to where the Crow is ending up going after a character called T-Bird. So we have it to where the Crow is eventually going into someone's car and just driving around. And T-Bird is starting to reflect on the fact that this guy had been a person that he had killed previously, and that ultimately he is mentioning, it's like, dude, you're dead. We killed you. It's like, there ain't no coming back. There ain't no coming back. And so we have it to where the Crow is very much being chased after police because this car is basically on a terror and doing all kinds of bad like things going on. It seems that this character Angel David, who is Skank, and I'll just call him Angel David. I won't call him his actual character name. Um, we ultimately have him who was looking into T-Bird, but then eventually, when T-Bird eventually gets commandeered by the Crow in his own car, by and large, like T-Bird is kind of being left to his own devices, and Skank is kind of like wandering after him. But then eventually, when T-Bird eventually gets killed, Angel David is realizing that it's like, dude, I'm out of here. Like, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna go to Top Dollar, and Top Dollar is gonna end up sending all his cronies in and come after the Crow. So, because what ends up happening is T-Bird ends up getting duct taped to his car seat and ending up being driven off of a cliff and killed. So, or just driven into a car accident that ultimately kills him. So, we have it to where now Gideon has mentioned about the Crow and this goofy looking guy that is admittedly coming after him, and then eventually Angel David ends up going to Top Dollar and mentioning, hey man, there's a vigilante after all of us. And ultimately now Top Dollar is starting to get ticked off about all this, and eventually he is just going like, okay, well, let's send in all the men in. We're gonna have Angel David's character as bait, and we ultimately have Top Dollar with a crony named I think his name is Grunge, and this guy is of course the guy with the glasses, the big tall guy who a lot of people probably know as Candyman, or the guy from any number of either zombie films or Final Destinations or anything like that. So we basically have within here now the Crow having to get one last person, and so eventually that leads into seemingly Top Dollar desperately trying to figure out how exactly to take this person down. So it seems that they realize that this guy is consistently being teamed up with the Crow via everything that he does. So they decide to end up going and subduing this Crow at some point in this movie. So, because at first we end up having eventually to where the Crow is going into Top Dollar's place of abode while they're all kind of sitting around and kind of making plans to kill this guy. So we ultimately have the Crow breaking into Top Dollar's headquarters, and they end up, of course, bejokingly, as per usual within this movie, every time a hero comes into the mix, basically the villain just shoots him and think that it's all good. And then, of course, the Crow gets right back up, and so then everybody lights him up with bullets. That, of course, doesn't work, and so they end up going like, yeah, there's no way to beat this guy, but then they realize that there is a Crow with him. So they take this Crow and eventually end up stabbing the Crow numerous times. Grunge does. And so that leads to the Crow being very much mortal. But the Crow eventually goes and kills Angel Davis's character, because ultimately realizing that the Crow ends up calling him... Phone goes off. Just scramble for that. But yeah, so ultimately we have it to where the Crow is, of course, taking down Angel Davis's character, Skank, and ultimately calling him by that name. And it's like, well, no, like, I'm not that. Like, if anything, look at that woman. That woman is actually that. I'm an innocent. I'm a guy that's just here. And it's like, well, no, not really. So we have it to where, of course, the Crow ends up having to kill his one last person, but he ends up finding out that Top Dollar is otherwise tied to Angel Davis's character, so it's just like, well, this seems like the song that is never going to end, but it ends with Top Dollar. Because ultimately we have it to where after the Crow kills all of these people, eventually he is heading to Top Dollar. Top Dollar eventually has Sarah eventually kidnapped and otherwise being tossed into the mix of her being kind of led to be. All right, well, I'm gonna pause here. All right, I had to turn my phone off because it kept giving notifications. It kept trying to do a review here and like getting phone calls and texts and whatever and all this kind of garbage. Anyways, so going into this, we have, because I'm just trying to finish this review up. Good grief. So we go into this and we have Top Dollar eventually going into desperately realizing that even with the Crow being mortal, Top Dollar still has to put some work in. And so ultimately we have Top Dollar assuming and or thinking that he is easily just going to beat this guy like everyone else in his life. He's basically always been the top guy. So justifiably, when the Crow is going after Top Dollar, Ernie Hudson arrives and justifiably helps out the Crow by taking out this character called Grunge. And so then eventually we find out that Ernie Hudson's character ends up getting hurt in the process, and eventually the Crow is eventually there to kind of help out Ernie Hudson's character. And then Ernie Hudson's game plan is like, well, hey, like, how about you be my human shield? You kind of like shield me, and we go up there and they light up all their bullets into you, and then eventually I'll just arrest them shortly thereafter. And Eric is like, well, that sounds like a great plan, but the only problem is that I'm bleeding now. And Ernie Hudson was like, well, I didn't think you could do that. And he's like, yeah, I didn't know I could do that either. So we have it to where Ernie Hudson is pushed to going like, well, okay, well, um, let's otherwise try some things and hope that you can get to Top Dollar, because ultimately Top Dollar has Sarah, who is on the roof and ultimately being held hostage to have Top Dollar be uh, this big Ash-like threat. So we have it to where eventually the Crow ends up bargaining for Sarah, and Sarah ends up getting kind of tossed off the way. And then eventually Top Dollar and Crow eventually have a fight out, and basically we have like Top Dollar with a sword. Like bizarrely, there was like some sword looking thing on the very top of this building that the Crow ends up breaking off to fight Top Dollar with. And so eventually we have it to where like the Crow is very or the Top Dollar is very interesting, how basically he lets us know that the Crow, the other Crow character, the literal Crow, eventually like yeah, the Crow came in here, and then he was like, oh god, I'm dead. Oh f, I'm dead. Like yeah, like that's what we're gonna do to you. And so eventually we have it to where the Crow is fighting off Top Dollar and eventually ending up. What do you think? The Crow's gonna win, of course, because that's just his driving force. We'll ultimately have his biggest weapon is that he's going to showcase to Top Dollar every single hour of those 4 hours of Shelley being in utter anguish and pain and saving all of this up, all for top dollar. So we have it to where top dollar is in utter despair and anguish and pain to the point of death. And so everything is eventually just resolved. We have it to where ultimately Sarah is down to meet Ernie Hudson to try to watch over him, and the Crow is eventually going, okay, well, like let's try to get Ernie Hudson some medical health, some ambulance, some because this guy's gonna bleed out otherwise. But justifiably, the Crow is just looking at like, okay, everything seems to be done. Sarah, make sure that you're watching over Ernie so he doesn't bleed out. And ultimately, Ernie Hudson is asking for a cigarette, but ultimately, once he starts smoking it, he's realizing that, ugh, yuck, like I don't want to smoke anymore. I'll quit smoking if I live. Because funny enough, when Ernie Hudson's character was smoking earlier, eventually the Crow basically tells him it's bad for him. And I think when Eric touches him before, it gets him to want to kick this habit of smoking. Um, Interestingly enough, I think every time the Crow touches somebody, he takes away some of their bad habits. So we have it to where Eric eventually is going back into his grave thinking that he is just going to die, and he is met by Shelley's spirit to tell him, okay, hey, like it's okay to come back. Like it's okay to like you can rest now. And eventually we end this movie off with Eric, of course, just dying for seemingly the second time now that he is mortal. So this is how this movie eventually just gets resolved. If anything, it's great to like there are a lot of times when the Crow ends up keep just going along to being a person of vengeance, a person to fight against the innocent and this and that. But in this movie, it's like no, like he ended up doing his job. Now he can, in metaphorical terms, go home. So that is the one thing that I like best about this movie is just the way it resolves and ends. And in the end, it's not one of those where it has to be that no, he has to keep going, he has to keep doing this, and he has to clean up this horrible city. No, it's he did his job. Now he's done. Now he can go home. So speaking of going home, I think it's about that time to resolve this review. I'm gonna get out of here. Ultimately, I apologize, but otherwise there being seemingly a phone ringing during this process. Yeah, trying to finally get this review out and finally just get it done ends up being not quite as easy as you would think. So, anyways, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.